Hello. Thanks everyone for being here. Just give us a few minutes to pull up the PowerPoint and we'll get started.
Good morning.
Good
Good
morning.
morning. There we go. All right, Kenzie, I'm going to go ahead and start the recording if you want to start us off.
Yeah.
Looks like it's going.
Let me know when we're ready. Is it recording, Bree?
Yep, looks like
Okay. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to get started so we have enough time for today's webinar. I just want to say thank you for making the time to attend the Understanding Human Trafficking and Supporting Survivors in Recovery Settings. Our speaker today will be Deborah Monroe. Deborah Monroe is a Michigan certified peer support specialist, a recovery coach, and a community health worker with over 15 years of experience. She is the founder and CEO of Hope 365 and Recovery Concepts, organizations dedicated to peer-led recovery, consultation, and training statewide. Appointed by 2 governors, Deborah served 3 terms on Michigan's Human Trafficking Commission, where she worked to raise awareness and improve responses to survivors. She is also a national speaker who shares her lived experience with mental health, substance use, incarceration, and human trafficking, demonstrating the recovery is possible. In addition, she has trained and certified more than 100 incarcerated men and women as peer support specialists, recovery coaches in Michigan prisons, continuing to mentor and support them in their journey.
Thank you. All right, so thank you for introducing me. And yeah, my name is Deborah Monroe, and I am from Michigan. So I'm excited to be with you today just to talk about human trafficking. I am gonna have some questions for you today too, and so hopefully this will be interactive. I don't want to just sit here and just talk for 2 hours, but I would love to get some interaction and some feedback on some questions that I may have. And anytime that you may have a question, just let me know. I'm always open to answering. And then the other thing that I want to do is I just want to let you know is that some of the material that I talk about could be a trigger for some individuals. And so just just take care of yourself. If you need to reach out to one of the hosts, or, just making sure that you take care of yourself. Next slide, please. And so today I'm hoping that, you're going to walk away from this presentation with a better understanding of what human trafficking is and why it's important. So the course objectives is that by the end of this class, you're going to be able to describe what human trafficking is. You're going to be more aware of signs and of human trafficking, and we're going to discuss the importance of sensitivity when communicating with someone that may have been trafficked. You'll be more aware of potential biases and acting on stereotypes in the provision of care, and then challenges that may come up with trafficking victims, and then special consideration when working with trafficking victims. And so we're going to kind of cover a little bit of that. And so my question to you is, what is human trafficking? Like, what do you know about it?
What I know about it is just the usually involves the grooming of a person, whether it's a young person or an older person, but often young people, at least in the populations that I work with. And it's oftentimes been related to just vulnerable people and either from some of the people that I've worked with is they get items and valuable things, or if they are using substances, not all people who are trafficked use substances, but many do, whether it was that was their way in, and people would take advantage of the fact that they were looking and drug seeking, or they just noticed the vulnerable parts of them, and then often, it will end up being sexual human trafficking. So you have people who are exploiting these young people or these other or any other population, exploiting them for their own gain without, well, keeping them like dependent on them.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Anybody else? Like, what do you know about it?
I can say that it's a for human trafficking. This is basically the person who taken advantage for somebody who's a vulnerable. They can be taken advantage economically or personally using the power. Um, it could be like for sex or for drugs or for food, for anything. So it's gonna be like a basically taking advantage for that way using the power.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Anyone else? So what are you hoping to hear or learn through this presentation today? What is like one thing that you really want to know about or something that you want to learn about?
Something that has, oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, there's no name, so I don't know. I see a hand up and then next person.
For me, it's to learn how to communicate with the individuals that have been through human trafficking and to get an idea. I don't know, just get educated on it.
Okay, so education and communication. Okay.
Yeah, I do work with a few individuals who have self-admitted that they have been trafficked themselves. So yeah, I haven't experienced that myself, and so kind of relate or connect with them in a way.
Okay.
In a better way.
And then Tara, I believe you were next with the hand.
Yeah, so I work in a inpatient setting with adolescents 12 to 18, and we fairly frequently get at least one or two at a time every few months or so that has who has experienced trafficking and survived it. And the thing that I've noticed is that they tend to have a really difficult time with being inpatient and like feeling that trappedness. And so I think I'd like to learn more ways to communicate with them and help them understand, like, or not help them understand, but just understand where they're coming from so that I can better support them as the counselor, and help them not feel as trapped, even though they are in like we're ASAM level 3.5, so pretty high intensity recovery setting. And I just want to learn more about how to help them feel safe in an environment that might be re-traumatizing.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And then there's one more other person with their hand up.
Yeah, Lonnie.
Yeah, so I just want to hopefully get some more like resources for my citizens and clients and how to help them, where to go to if they need any extra support. And then just kind of learn a little bit more about human trafficking and services for recovery and stuff like that.
Okay. Well, I will tell you guys, you're probably going to know more about human trafficking by the end of this presentation than you wanted to know.
That's great.
All right. And so, the next few slides that we're going to look at is going to be questions with a true and false, with true and false. So next slide. So the question I have is, human trafficking requires the movement of a person from one location to another at least once. What do you think that is? True or false?
True. True.
True.
Anybody else? True? Okay.
It might be false.
It is false. And so the reason is that, years ago, you had to move someone across state lines for it to be human trafficking. But today, a person doesn't have to be moved because a person can be trafficked right in the location that they're at. And so it's not true. A person, doesn't have to go from one location to another for it to be trafficking. Next slide. So most victims of human trafficking are kept against their will through the use of physical means. Is that true or false?
False.
Anybody, true? All right, it is false. Yeah, because a lot of times it is not the physical abuse that is used, it's the psychological abuse that they use to control an individual. Next slide. There is a clear line separating prostitution from human trafficking. True or false?
False.
Okay. Yep,
I'll
it
say
is
false.
false. Yep. So yeah, it is false. There is not a clear line, even though there is a movement for sex workers, right? And those are individuals. We did a soap outreach a couple of years ago in Las Vegas, and during that time we were going and educating about the Super Bowl and human trafficking. They actually had a sex worker conference there, and so there are some individuals that may choose to be involved in that life, that work. But there's it's a thin line between the two, because someone that may be in that line of work is also more vulnerable to being trafficked. All right, next slide. So foreign nationals, traffickers are typically, and you can choose any that apply, government officials from neighboring countries, from the victim's ethnic or national community, known to the victim, relative of the victim.
I would say all of them.
Mhm. Yeah, so all of them, it's really, you think about, government officials, right? There's been government officials here in the United States that have trafficked individuals from their communities. And so again, is that, and then when you think about individuals from economic or national community, who better knows those vulnerabilities than someone that has been there, right? Or knows what those struggles may be. And then, a lot of times that the individual knows that trafficker, and it's usually someone that's related. And we're going to talk about that in a little while. Next slide. And so a condition of a T visa being granted is that foreign nationals must testify in court against their trafficker, which is usually why they are not granted. True or false?
What's a T visa?
So it is so you know how people come on like work visa or school visas to be in the United States? It's another type of visa that is granted for an individual to be in the United States.
Say true.
It is true. Yes, and so, a lot of times there's a condition for them to get that T visa. And what it's been is that they have to testify against their trafficker. And a lot of times, especially when it comes to foreign nationals, is they don't want to be as someone, they don't want to be seen by their family or their community as a victim. It also may it may also cut down on visas that, like work visas, if they're here on a work visa. Let's say they come over here on a work visa and they are labor trafficked or even sex trafficked, right? And, and then they testify against their trafficker, that person may have a hard time coming back to the United States. And someone just posted that, let me see here really quick. Testifying is hard for everyone. I'm not sure if it's in the United States completely, but I know for Michigan is that we're looking at how to take away to be able to prosecute someone without using a person's testimony. Because when a person gets up in front of the stand and they see that trafficker, and especially if there's a connection, an emotional connection to that individual, a lot of times people have a hard time testifying. And so they're looking at, being able to prosecute without the testimony of an individual and looking at other ways to prosecute that person. Next slide. So labor trafficking requires an element of either force, fraud, or coercion, even for minors, different for that of commercial sex exploitation. True or false?
False.
True.
It is true. And so there's a difference between the two. When it comes to labor trafficking, you have to have that force, fraud, or coercion. When it comes to sex trafficking, those things do not apply because a minor cannot consent. It is automatically trafficking. Next slide. Charity, thank you for sharing. So human trafficking, what is it? You know, it's modern day slavery. It's a devastating human rights violation. It's the ultimate exploitation. It's a state and federal crime in the US. And, you know, one of the things that I learned was that Washington State was the first state to criminalize human trafficking in 2003. And then other states followed behind them. So I thought that was kind of, you know, so you guys were the first ones to actually criminalize human trafficking. All right, next slide. And so when you think about slavery, right? Slavery is an ancient trade. And so, you know, one of the first documented slaves in history was, you know, in the Old Testament when a man sold his brother into slavery. In more recent centuries, you tend to relate the term slavery to the transatlantic slave trade. And in 1865, you know, slavery was officially made illegal in the US, but making something illegal doesn't always mean that it no longer exists. And so slavery continues to be a reality today, and it's a crime hidden in plain sight, and it's growing. You know, you think about, you know, slavery may look different over time, but again, it's still just as inhumane. And so why is slavery so prevalent today?
Capitalistic exploitation of people.
Okay, yep, exploitation, greed, yep. Anything else?
Dehumanization is like common. We do it not like little bit by little bit here and there, and it adds up.
Yep. You know, I want you to look at a couple of items, and I want you to consider the link between these different things, right? And I have a Hershey's bar, you know, just a regular size Hershey bar. I have a purse, just a regular, ordinary purse. And I have a cell phone. Okay. What do you think these three things have in common?
Somebody made them.
Okay, somebody made them. Well, let me ask this question. How much would you pay for this chocolate bar?
$1.
$1, yeah.
Where do y'all get yours at? He charged me $2.59 today.
50
Well, that's why
cents.
I wouldn't buy it then. But if they give me for $1, I'll buy it.
Right. And you know what? Again, I guess it would depend on where you buy it from, right? Because I could probably go to the dollar store and get this for $1.25. Or I can go into the supermarket and pay market value for it, right? And so you think about how do you determine what the price is of this candy bar? The second one is this purse. Like, how much would you pay for this purse? It is a Serena Richie. Never heard of it, but it's just, you know, it's like a plastic almost.
Depends
It's
where you
one
bought it.
open pouch, huh?
I said, I think it depends where you bought it.
I don't know. It could have been like DSW or I don't know. Not an expensive, you know, nothing, just like your chain box stores.
Yeah, $15, $20 maybe. I don't know.
Okay, so $15, $20. How much would you pay for this Michael Kors purse?
200. A little less.
But why? I have two purses. They both serve
Yeah.
the same purpose, right?
I think it's just the name of the purse, right? The
So it's
brand.
based
You know,
on
it's a
the
good brand.
name. Okay,
Yeah.
so it's based on the brand of the purse
Right.
and what the going rate is for that purse, right?
Yeah.
How much
Sure.
would you pay for, let's say, an iPhone 16?
It's out there. So kind of what I'm kind of getting from you is that they're all products,
Mhm.
but they're all different products on different with different values and how they.
Yeah.
So that's how they um the trafficking would look at it as the same. So like a child would be kind of more different product than a older adult. Is that what you're trying to get to?
No, so when you think about this phone, when it first came out, how much was the price?
That could have been, gosh,
Over $1,000, I
1,000.
think.
Yes.
It was almost $1,600.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But as more people bought it, what happened?
The value
the
drop.
value went down.
The value went down, and so you could buy it for a cheaper rate, right? So let me ask this question. How much would you pay for this 15-year-old girl? Is it based on what she looks like? What she does? Look, don't everybody be quiet now. No.
Well, I wouldn't pay anything for her for one. But,
Right.
I see
And
your
you think about, you think about too is that, how do you determine a person's worth, right? And you think about those other products, we based it on, a brand or what it looked like or how much everybody else was paying for it. And so how do you determine the worth of a person? How do you put a price on a human being? And so the thing is that, in the 1800s, if a person was being sold into slavery, and you think about it was about $40,000 in today's market, right? Or back then it was like about $40,000. Today you can buy a 15-year-old girl for $95. Wow. Because of the demand. Because when there is a demand for something, you get more supply. And so, and that's why over, like it, you see so much, you hear about it more often, because there is a demand for it. Next slide. Well, before you can go to the next slide, but I just want to talk about this really quick. You think about what this link is between these products that I showed you, right? You think about Hershey's. Hershey's is a probably billion-dollar company. They make a lot of profit, right? And you think about their products are sold at every holiday. They make a lot of money. But you know what? They get some of the product to make this bar from other countries, and they use slave labor to make it. And Hershey is aware of that. And they said that, that they were going to change some of their practices, but they still haven't done it because of that bottom line. They still want that profit. The other thing is you think about all of the materials that go into making a cell phone. Where do they come from? A lot of times different components of that phone are in different areas that all bring into one. The phone is manufactured, put together, and then brought to the United States and sold. And a lot of times what these products that we use are being done by slave labor. And a lot of times children. And we're going to talk about that in a little while too. So when you look at this map right here, these highlighted red dots on here is, and right over there, over by you, you see it's lit up there, right? And so these are areas that human trafficking has been reported. And so some cases may involve more than one location. So you might have a victim that is over, let's say over in New York or the Boston area, and they travel a circuit. And so a lot of times when individuals are traveling, they're traveling to different states based on, and there's a lot of different factors that play into it, like weather, events, things that they're following. And so again, is that you may have a victim in one area that may get, let's say, arrested, and then they'll travel to another location and get arrested and things like that. And so, this crime right here is hard to track about how many victims there's, because you might have one victim that has been reported multiple times. The other thing is that they say is that, and I will tell you my statistics, I always say don't take them as, it's because the statistics are always changing as new information comes up, right? And so, but there's more than 244,000 children in the US that are at risk. I don't know about your state, but we see more and more all the time here is that this person just disappeared. Where are these kids going? Right? 83% of sex trafficking victims found in the US were actually US citizens, because we want to believe that it's coming from other countries, but no, it's happening right here in the United States. And then the other thing is, like what have you heard about your state? Where do you rank? Is it number one, number two?
You like 4?
Number 4? I will tell you, it's, we've heard a lot of times that Michigan is number 2, but that's a myth. And the reason that is and how it came out in 2015, they started doing this operation called Cross Country. And what they do is state, local authorities, and, get together and they go out and they do these sting operations to recover minors. They also do recover adults too that are in this trade. And so each year it's difficult to say how many people will be recovered. And when they first did it, I think Arizona had the highest number of recovered individuals, and Michigan came in number 2 at 19 people that were recovered that year. But every year it changes, because you never know how many people will be recovered during those 3-day operations. I will tell you is that the youngest person that has been documented as being recovered was a 3-month-old baby. It was a babysitter that was advertising them on a website, a couple of years ago. And you think about it is that, so no state can say, that they're number 1 or number 2. It just depends on, how many of those people are being recovered. 7,473 potential trafficking situations, through Polaris. So I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Polaris. It is a national human trafficking line that puts out a lot of information, but it also gives a lot of resources. And their hotline is that you can actually call and report. And so during February to mid-July, they've already received 7,473 calls, texts, whatever, to, for potential trafficking situations. Next slide, please.
Do you by any chance have the 1030.0 Brady?
So, Oh, sorry. So you think about known cases in Washington, right? And see, these are some of the statistics broke down by, counties. And it was actually looked at through the labor trafficking and then sex trafficking. And I want you guys to keep in mind, though, is that these numbers reflect cases served by agencies, right? They may not reflect all trafficking incidences that occurred, because there are also cases, or categorized as out of state. It could be not reported or unknown. And they may not have received any services. And so these are just some of the numbers that come up within your state that shows where it's happening at, and what type of trafficking it is. Are any of you surprised to see any of those counties on there at all?
I'm mostly surprised that counties like King or Pierce aren't higher, and that Cowlitz County is up there.
Okay.
I agree.
Yeah, so they are, okay, yeah, so they have labor and sex trafficking there, yeah. And sometimes you think about different communities that may be rural. We have a community here, it's called Sheboygan. Nothing happens there. It's a very small county. People go there in cabins sometimes to get away for the, like summer vacations or stuff like that. And they actually had cases there where labor trafficking was happening. People were using labor trafficking for their businesses in restaurants. getting people in there to work at no cost or low cost wages and living in inhumane conditions.
Well, and in the counties that are higher, it's probably because they have access to water systems that go straight out to oceans and other countries way quicker than other ones.
Okay, yeah. And then you think about events too, like is there anything that goes on in those counties that, promote people coming in? So the next slide. So Polaris did, like I said, is they are the hotline for human trafficking. And so they get different signals from different individuals. And some of the ways that their signals are monitored is that they have the hotline calls, they have like text messages, they have online reporting, they have emails received, and then web chat. So there's a lot of different ways that you can connect with them. And Human Trafficking Hotline has received 9,080 signals in Washington State since its inception. And, a lot of times, and that doesn't count all of the different situations or cases because not everybody is aware of Polaris and what they do. 2,599 of those cases were in Washington State. And they had 4,562 victims were identified in those cases. And so, you're probably asking, why was there more victims, but only 2,000 cases, but 4,000 victims? Because a lot of times when you are in those situations, there may be more than one victim within that ring or whatever is going on. Next slide. And so why is it happening? It's because it's fast growing. It's surpassing, drugs and guns. If I was a drug dealer or a gun dealer, I would have to take money up front, buy my product, go back, sell it, right? And the risk in the past has been really high because if you got caught with drugs or gun, you're going to prison. And, you think about and then I got to take my profit and I have to reinvest it into my product. When it comes to human trafficking, for a long time, there was no consequences for the trafficker, right? And so I don't necessarily have to invest much into this product. I just have to find a victim, maybe pay for a hotel room for one night, and the rest of it is all profit. I don't have to keep on reinvesting into that. The other thing is it's not reported like other crimes. And like I said, is they just started a couple of years ago, started looking at this in a different way, looking at as a crime and then getting those statistics. And, a few years ago, it used to be like a $32 billion industry. Today, it is a $150 billion industry, and it's growing. And so, and they've, when we think about this is that when you think about labor and sex trafficking, right? There's one thing they both have in common, and that is force, fraud, and coercion. Next slide. I'm just going to look at someone just put something in chat. Sorry. Yeah. All right, so how are victims trafficked? And so for labor or commercial sex exploitation, for it to be trafficking, it must involve one of each of these. And so there's force, like physical restraint, beating, isolation, starvation, to control the victim. I had someone tell me one time is that they trained them like dogs, because if I take what they need away from them, whether it be drugs, food, whatever, right? And I give it to them when I want to, then they look at me more as I want to say, like, more like a savior than anything, right? They don't no longer look at that individual as like a punishment. They're looking at, okay, they're giving me what I need. The other thing is that when you think about fraud, it's false and deceptive offers of employment, marriages, better life, the American dream. How many of you have seen Pretty Woman? You know, that's like Hollywood's version of it. And that is not the reality of what it is to be, to be in those situations. The other one is coercion. And so the threats of serious harm to the victim, their family, or another person if they fail to perform. A lot of times, this is where you see a lot of that psychological manipulation. They also are controlled through debt, bondage, usually in the context of paying off a debt. And a lot of times they may not even know how much they owe or when that debt would be paid off. And in many cases, the victims are trapped into a cycle of debt. We had here is that we had someone that was going over to Russia and bringing women under the pretense of models. And so they got them over here. They were living they had them in an affluent neighborhood, buying them dinner, nice dinners, buying them clothes, having them stay in a nice house. And then when they got everyone over here, they said, now you owe us this money for the dinners, the clothes, the house, and the transportation, like the flights and all of that. You have to pay off this debt. And so they put him in a strip club right on 8 Mile, right there at the Detroit border. And they were put in the basement. That's where they lived, and were told not to engage with the customers or say what was going on in the business. And one woman did tell that, and you think about 8 Mile is like one of the busiest streets. It's the border between multiple counties. And you had this going on right in front of people, and nobody knew it was happening. These women were being basically held hostage in this club, and forced to work and give up every dime that they made, saying that they owed a debt. And so again, so if, let's say a person, is recruited by, let's say, physical force to serve as a maid, right? Then they would be considered a victim. Or if someone was like snatched off the streets and forced into prostitution, they would be a victim of human trafficking. But you need to have these components. The only time that these components do not exist is when the person is under the age of 18 for sex trafficking. Next slide. And so, like, victims of human trafficking, it could be anyone, right? It could be a documented or undocumented individual. It could be male or female, children and adults, individual, family, or groups, educated or illiterate, U.S. citizen or foreign born. There's a diverse in age, race, class, gender, religion, and culture with multiple needs. And again, like we talked about, there's many ways that a person can be trafficked, but we're going to talk about like the labor and the sex trafficking. Next slide. And so when you think about labor trafficking, it's the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, debt bondage, or slavery. So some examples of, let's say, labor trafficking could be domestic servitude, like a nanny, maids, fiancés. I can only talk about the experiences that I've had. I worked at a crisis center. A woman came in and said that she had been brought over from another country to be, it was like a bride situation. She thought she was being married to this man, and ended up, she married him, but he wanted her to take care of his disabled brother. And so that wasn't what she signed up for. And then she had a hard time getting away. And so she came there looking for someone to help her. You think about maids, and also those nannies. It could be factories. It could be construction sites, migrant, agriculture work. If you have rural areas, you can get the Farmer's Almanac, and it will tell you how many workers should be on those farms, how much they should be getting paid, things like that. There's janitorial jobs, food service, hotels. And when you think about hotels, you got two things going on. You could have labor trafficking, and you could have sex trafficking there, because it could be the maids are being trafficked, and then some of the guests could be being trafficked. Panhandling. How many of you have seen individuals standing out on the street asking for money? Have you ever seen children out there? You're starting to see younger people go out there. We have people like young young kids, maybe 12, 13 years old with backpacks standing outside on the freeways when people come off the freeways asking for money. And a lot of time what it is it's it's an organized enterprise where someone is exploiting these kids for, let's say they give them a stipend for going out there and then they give the money that they made there because people feel sorry for kids. The other one is lawn care services. It could be sales crews, begging rings, and so, a friend of mine, do you guys have it where you ever seen those advertisements where they say magazine sales, that it's a great career during the summer, you can travel, it's fun, and you make money? Well, a lot of times, we had a gentleman there was a gentleman that was selling magazines in a community over in Macomb County, and he was going door to door, and one of my friends, intercepted him, and he came in and he was giving his spiel. And, this was a grown man, this was an adult. And my friend was security at this mobile home park or whatever, and he asked him, he goes, well, where do you live? And he goes, oh, I live a couple blocks over with my grandmother. And he goes, oh, because I've never seen you before. And he goes, yeah, I've been here for a little bit. And so my friend at the end, the guy wanted to use his phone. He used his phone and then he left out. My friend didn't buy any magazines. Well, whoever he had called came and picked him up. And the man was assaulted right there outside in front of everyone and then put in the car and he drove away. So my friend called the police to let them know what he had witnessed, and they kept on calling that phone number. Well, the gentleman was dropped off in Genesee, which is like your Flint area, and at a bus stop. And to find out he had been missing from Ohio for a little bit of time. And people would say as well, this is a grown man. Why didn't he leave? He was able to walk the neighborhoods and stuff like that. A lot of times we don't understand or know why that person didn't leave. We don't know if they've been threatened. Maybe his family was threatened, and so again, is that, or maybe there was an addiction there. You just don't know. And so my question to you is, how many slaves work for you?
Well, we're talking about slaves not too long ago in a group, and I guess in the past people would sell themselves in a sense. If I owed you, then I'm kind of I'm in debt to you, so I will do something for you in that sense, that type of slavery.
Right. Well, you think about, the answer usually is like none. I don't got no slave. I don't have any slaves, right? And so, but the thing is that, you think about who picked the cotton for the shirt that you have on your back. Who cut the cane for the sugar that someone may have put in their coffee today? Who picked the tobacco that you may smoke, right? And so when you think about that, there is this interactive website that you can go to. It's called slaveryfootprint. I think it's .com or .org. And what you do is that you can go in there. It's going to ask you a whole bunch of questions about your life, like how you spend your money and what kind of products you buy and what you use. And, I did that, and it actually came up that I actually had 38 slaves based on the things that I buy, which I thought was pretty interesting. And so one way that we can stop slavery, because, I don't think that I'll ever be able to stop it in my lifetime, but I can make a difference in the things that I buy. So, next slide, please. And so the next one is sex trafficking. And so this is the recruiting, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining of person for the purpose of commercial sex act, in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. And so, or in which the person included to perform such an act has not obtained the age of 18 years of age. And so, yep, I put that in there. Yeah. And so you think about sex trafficking operations occur in highly visible, venues such as, you know, you might not see it as much today, but street prostitution, right? It could be brothels that operate out of residential homes. It could be hotels and motels. It could be strip clubs as a front, because I will tell you, most of these strip clubs today do not pay their dancers. You know, the dancer actually comes into a club owing money before they even start their shift. And so they have to pay the bouncer, they have to pay the DJ, they have to pay whoever, right? And so I will tell you, you know, as an ex-dancer, you do not make enough money on those tips. The way that you're going to make your money is that you go into those back rooms. And, you know, a lot of times you would hear people say is, I would never do that. You know, and when you mix alcohol and drugs in that kind of environment, sooner or later that individual will, you know, lower their expectation and will do those things, which makes them even more vulnerable to trafficking. I always say is that it's the establishment that is trafficking them, or at least grooming them for trafficking for the next person to come in, you know? And so you think about escort agencies, online, you know, truck stops and things like that. I know you guys have a great ally with, you know, Truckers Against Trafficking, going out and advocating, and then also having their eyes open when they go into different truck stops and reporting those when they see it. Next slide. And so you think about like who's vulnerable. I can probably say that every single one of you has vulnerabilities, right? You know, we all have some vulnerabilities in our lives, but it's when someone takes those vulnerabilities and exploits them, you know. And so vulnerable populations could be as individuals with a history of abuse, neglect, or from dysfunctional families. It could be children placed in the foster care and juvenile justice system. A lot of these, you know, times these places are put there to protect the child, and actually what it does, it creates harm, right? Because they may be doing to that child what a trafficker already's done. Runaways and homeless youth. We're talking about the LGBTQ community, and then migrant workers, especially the undocumented. And so human trafficking reaches every culture and demographic, and traffickers will use victim particular vulnerabilities to exploit the risk factors. And that can include, you know, immigration status. Someone might come on a visa and have on a work visa, and a trafficker may use that status, allow that visa to run out, and then you hold it over that individual's head and say, well, now you're undocumented, and if you don't do what I say, I'm going to report you. It could be poverty, and I've seen that in chat a little bit, is that, you know, people want a better life, right? They don't want to live in poverty. They want a better life. I always often say, as we have a mental health organization down in Detroit, I could pull up there and say, I need 4 people to come in the car right now. I'll give you $50 a piece. And I'm going to have people fighting over each other to get in that car and not even question what it is that I want from them. You know, because for them, they may be looking for, they have a need for food or shelter or substances, alcohol, you know, whatever it may be, and I can exploit those vulnerabilities that they have. The other thing is that, you know, I don't know, you know, there's a huge unhoused, you know, unsheltered population. And, you know, and so again, is that, you know, people are looking, and like I think that you said earlier, is that sometimes, especially with children that may be runaways, you know, they may be exchanging sex just for a place to stay. You know, and again, that is considered trafficking because another person is taking advantage of that vulnerability that they have. There's mental illness. It could be substance abuse, and I will tell you, drugs are not free. And so how do you support that habit? No meaningful social network, especially if the person doesn't have supports. And then there's a need to be loved, right? And so, you know, for me, you know, if you would have asked me when I was younger, you know, what was my life like, I would have told you it was like anybody else's. I would have told you that I had a mom and dad, I had 2 brothers, and, you know, it just seemed normal. I lived in a very rural area, so I wasn't exposed to a lot of, you know, street culture or anything like that. I was pretty naive and pretty sheltered in the country and stuff like that. And I remember, you know, like my mom and dad, my dad was a chronic alcoholic, and he really struggled with, you know, he was functional. He could go to work every day, but as soon as he got home, he would drink. And a lot of times it became physical abuse with my mom. And my mom at the same time was struggling with her own trauma because, growing up, she was, sexually abused, and things like that, removed from the home, a lot of abandonment issues. And so for her, when things got tough, she would just get up and leave and disappear. And so a lot of times me and my brothers would end up in foster care. And, it started when I was about 4 years old. And so we would go in and out of foster care. Now, my brothers would go together because they were younger, and then I would end up by myself in strange homes. Some of those homes were very nurturing, and you could tell that they cared about you. And then there was other ones that you knew they were just there for, to collect whatever money they got for having kids in their home. And, we would go in, became a revolving door because we'd go in, we'd be there for a short period of time. My mom and my dad would get back together. They would figure out, get a place to live, and then we would all come back together again. And so I struggled with a lot of abandonment issues. I used to think that it was me. And as I started getting older, around 10 years old, my mom said she was going to bingo one day and she never came back. And so, that I really struggled with that. My dad, we ended up back in foster care. And when he came back this time, he has this new woman that he's with, and she's gonna nurture us, I guess. And I was really resentful. I was really angry. And I remember just saying, running away. And, I remember being, I had this thing in my mind that I was going to live with the fair because, I had watched a movie where people were different, like the carnies were different. You had the bearded woman and the stretch guy and stuff like that. And they were different, but they had this family or this connection with each other. And that's what I wanted. I wanted someone to love me. And so I decided, at 12 years old that I was going to run away with the fair. Next slide. And so I go to the fair. I had just turned 13 years old. And when I get there, I'm not really sure what I'm looking for. But while I was there, I met this guy. He came up to me. He started talking to me. He didn't seem threatening to me. And I remember we spent most of the day there. He bought me something to eat. And you think about it, is I wasn't this cute little girl. I looked very tomboyish. I had red freckles, and so, I don't remember what our conversation was at the time, but I think about is that I must have shared something with him that he could use against me. Because by the time it started to get dusk, he asked me if I would show him around my town, and I said, sure, why not? I didn't feel threatened by him. Like I said, when you think about a trafficker, right? I didn't feel threatened. And so I got in the car with him and we started riding around. It was the first time that I was ever introduced to alcohol. By the time that evening ended, I was in Detroit. He put me in a motel room and and again, he left me there, and there was a kitten. And I remember thinking that I need to be the mom to this kitten. And so I stayed that night. The next day he came and picked me up. He said we were going back to Jackson, Michigan. I went back to Jackson and he said, hey, if you want to be with me, you're going to be sitting at this bench in an hour. And if you don't, good luck. Have a nice life. Here's $20. Go back to the fair. And so if you would have asked me, was I being forced? I would have told you no. Because I sat on that bench for that whole hour thinking, what did I do wrong? Why doesn't he want me? Why is he abandoning me? And so when he showed up an hour later, I got back in that vehicle. That night we went back to the hotel. It was my first, encounter, sexual encounter, was with him. And then the next day I was introduced to other girls in his home, most of them minors. I was the youngest at 13. He had 14, 16-year-olds and one 18-year-old. And so by that night, I was dressed and took to work. I was told what I needed to do. I shadowed one of the other females, and I stayed with this man for a really long time. And people say, well, why didn't you leave? Right? Well, my first week there, I remember one of the girls wanted to leave, and he had took her upstairs, and you could hear a lot of screaming and banging around. You didn't really know what was going on. But you could imagine, and when he brought her back down, he said, if anybody wants to leave me, no one will walk away. And what he had did was he had beat the bottom of her feet with a coat hanger. And so for me, I didn't want that to happen to me. That was the first time I had ever experienced anything like that. And so I stayed compliant. I'm going to do whatever it is that you ask me to do, and I'm not going to question nothing. And so, at 14, I was arrested for prostitution, and I was took to the juvenile home. And I remember being in the juvenile home, and the only person that could come get me was my dad. And my dad said he wasn't coming to get me because he wasn't going to lose a day's wage. And so I sat in the juvenile home, and I remember going up to the guards one day, and or the the staff, and they said, "Hey, we went past your house today." And I'm like, "Oh, you were in Jackson?" And they started laughing, and they were like, "No, the Crestwood," and which was a hotel known for prostitution and drugs. And they started laughing, and all of a sudden in that moment, I felt this guilt and that come over me. And so from then on, I never talked about what was going on. I remember finally my trafficker was able to convince my dad to come out and get me, and that he would pay him his day's wages if he did that, because every day that I sat in that juvenile home was a day that he missed out on money. And so my dad came and got me. He gave my dad $80, and my dad left that day and just drove away. And the trafficker told me is that, you know what, I told you no one cares about you but me. And that was something that there was a lot of things that he told me, and a lot of those things that he told me were true. Like, the police are never going to protect you, because every time I had in contact with law enforcement, guess what? I was arrested. So these were not my friends. They were not going to protect me, and so you thought about that. So what I did was I started lying about who I was. I started changing my appearance, dyed my hair blonde. Next slide. And I remember at 15, I went back to Jackson, and I was really familiar with DHS, the Children's Services. And I remember walking in their office and telling them that I needed help because I didn't know what to do anymore, and I didn't want to be in that lifestyle. And they told me I went from that day from being a neglected child to a delinquent, because I hadn't been in school in the last 2 years. And so now they criminalized me, and they put me back into a juvenile home until they can find me placement. And I remember as soon as they get me into placement, I walked in the front door and walked right out the back door, and I left and I went back to my trafficker. And I stayed with him all the way till adulthood. Next slide. Because this was the person that cared about me. This is the person that didn't leave me. This is the person that, gave me shelter, gave me food. And, when he was finally arrested for a prostitution empire, he was actually indicted on a RICO Act for a organized crime. I felt like he was abandoning me, like it wasn't fair. Why would he do this to me, and so it was really difficult. And when he left, that's when I started getting involved in drugs. I started using crack cocaine. Because you know what, when I used, I didn't care what people said to me. I didn't care how I was treated. I didn't care about anything. And, a lot of times they talk about how, there's these benefits, or, we think that this kind of lifestyle is glamorous, because you know what, TV does that. When you think about these different TV shows, like I said, like Pretty Woman, they glamorize this kind of life. And I will tell you, the only benefits that I got from it was, next slide, is going to jail. The only benefit that I got was with that when I was in jail, I could at least sleep. I could get some food. Because, from my trafficker, my addiction took over, and that became the most prominent thing in my life. The only time that I was able to get help is that if a judge says, okay, we're tired of you coming in front of us, because I was not looking or thinking about recovery. I didn't even think recovery was ever going to be possible, that this was how my life was going to be. And so I would, get told that I needed to go to a rehab, and I would attend the rehab, because if I didn't, I'd go to jail. And then I would go to a 3-quarter house. But, as much as I wanted to be in recovery, I was, and you think about the addiction to drugs, I was more addicted to the lifestyle than the drugs or even the trafficker. And so I kept on going back. Next slide. You think about too is that why won't victims step up and talk about it, right? And so, why don't these victims leave if they're not being chained down? Because a lot of times you want to believe that they're being forced against their will, and that they're being chained down to like a register with chains and things like that. And that's not how it works. A lot of times it's that psychological manipulation that trafficker will use, because you think about is if the person doesn't leave, then they're consenting to this. A lot of times they're just being compliant because whatever threats that have been used against them could be the reality and they don't want that to happen. A lot of times we like to blame the victim. Like, if, why didn't you tell someone? Because a lot of times people are not believed. I remember being out there and someone said, well, why didn't you ever go to law enforcement? Well, in Highland Park, some of those law enforcement officers were also pimps. They had women out there working. So who am I going to tell when they're doing the exact same thing that the person I'm going to tell on is doing? That's their peer. And so, and a lot of times we tend to criminalize the victim because, again, prostitution is illegal. And so when a victim is arrested, right? And a lot of times after 3 arrests, it becomes a felony and we tend to put them in prison. So when you see someone out there and, like, think about is like, have you ever seen someone out there? You know what they're doing out there? Like, what is the first thought that comes to mind?
What could I do?
Okay. What can I do? And a lot of times we may not have the resources to provide to someone, right? We don't know what those needs are, and so again is that, and the other thing is, well, if the person didn't, like we tend to, it's easier to point one finger at a person and not what, because we like to say that, we dismiss it. Like if I seen someone out there working it, oh, it's their choice, right? Or they're doing it for the drugs or they're doing it for whatever. Or let's say the person, well, you know what, they accept money for labor or sex trafficking. They chose that. That's their choice. We tend to blame them for like clothing choices, relationship history. If they have like, unhealthy relationships, we tend to blame it on the drugs or alcohol. And a lot of these things are just, it's not the root cause of it. A lot of times it's trauma, or things that they've already experienced. And when a trafficker comes through and picks up on what those vulnerabilities are, a lot of times it is hard for that individual to get out of it. So next slide. So when some of the general challenges for identification is that the hidden nature of the crime. A lot of times it can be right in plain sight and you don't even know it, that it's happening, right? Our society likes to pretend it's not happening, so don't worry about it. If I don't see it, then I don't have to worry about it. It's a lower class problem, not in my neighborhood. My trafficker was a very prominent person in our community. How he got arrested, I mean, he had a big house out in Bloomfield Hills. Had an elevator to the master bedroom, indoor swimming pool. He was respected by the community. People waved at him when he went by. And the only reason he got on their radar is that he was trying to sell a Rolls Royce. And so he went down to a car wash down on 7 Mile, which was known for drug dealers, and put a Rolls Royce up for sale. And it was the FBI was actually surveillancing the car wash. And what they did is that they made contact with him. They started talking to him. And he had asked them what they did. This guy said his boss was interested in the car. And, they talked about how they did offshore accounting. And he said, well, I got money that needs to be put in offshore accounts. And so they built this working relationship. It became a 2-year investigation. And he was given his money that he was getting from his girls and putting it into the hands of the FBI that was building a case against him. And that's how he got arrested. He wasn't even on anybody's radar. He had just bought a strip club and was getting ready to open it, and all of his girls would work there. And he was recruiting more girls to be able to be in that club. And so he had not been on anybody's radar. Like I said, he was a prominent person in the community. People respected him because they didn't know what he was or what he was doing at the time. The other thing is that there's this lack of understanding and awareness about human trafficking. And then there's this perception that victims are criminals. Like I said, is that if you're engaging in illegal activity, right, you're going to jail. And so you have a lot of individuals. I remember being in New York and arrested. I was a child. And I had, like I said, I had dyed my hair blonde and I started lying about who I was. I was put into adult jails, and because I was not considered a victim. I was considered a criminal. And that's why there was a low risk for traffickers, especially in this, because the only way that they would get arrested is if they transported someone across a state line. The other thing is victims rarely self-identify, because if you would have ever asked me if I was a victim, I would have told you no, right? Nope, I'm not a victim, because I don't want that. I don't want to identify as a victim. This was my choice. I chose to do this. And so, sometimes it makes it easier to be able to cope with some of those choices that you make, even though it's not your fault. Next slide. So you may not understand that they, again, barriers to victim self-identification is that they may not understand that they're considered a victim of a crime. I will tell you is that the language that we use when it comes to human trafficking it's clinical language, and a lot of individuals that are involved in this kind of, involved in trafficking are not going to necessarily know what those words mean. Human trafficking, and so, there's other words like, do you have a pimp? Do you have, someone that's controlling you? A lot of times they're looking at that person as their boyfriend or as their parent or a relative, or a friend even. And so they might not know what those words are. There's that shame and guilt, and there's that fear of arrest or deportation. It could be retaliation from the trafficker even, right? I remember thinking, he used to tell me that if you try to leave me, I'll know where you're at. And I was like, yeah, whatever. And so one day I didn't make enough money and I knew that I was going to get in trouble when I got home. And so I went to the Detroit airport and I booked a ticket to Washington, D.C. I had been there multiple times. I knew how to work that track and I was going to go there. And I remember calling him while I was at the, while I was there, and he said, "What would you do right now if you turned around and I was there?" And I will tell you, the fear that I felt in that moment was immobilizing. And so I get to Washington, D.C., and I'm there for a few days, and the next thing I know, he pulls up on me. And, and so in my mind, it validates again that this person's going to know where I'm at all times. I didn't know that the cab driver that usually, like would wait for these different groups to come in because he made money from them. Because a lot of times people would fly in and not take their vehicles. And so he could transport them back and forth. And so when he seen me, he just assumed that my trafficker was there with me and called him and wanted to know where he was at and did he need his cab service. And so, he automatically knew that. But in my mind in that moment, I didn't know that. And I just assumed that this person would know where I'm at. So again, I went back and I stayed. You think about too is, and sometimes you think about, how easy is it to get someone to do this. I was searching Backpage one day. I was looking at some of the ads before it closed down, and I came across an ad that I thought was very interesting, and so I want to share it with you. Next slide. And so it says is that you must be willing to work at a strip club for the next 3 to 6 months for this to be a possibility. Right now I have 25K and you only need to come up with another 10K dancing legally at a strip club. This may take you 14 to 90 days depending on how much of a go-getter you are. Once we have 35K, we'll be able to open a medical marijuana dispensary in a different state. This will produce a minimum of 105 every 120 days. After we get that first 105, if we reinvest half that money into opening 2 more dispensaries, we will now be able to make 315K every 120 days. Do the math. In 12 months, we will make over $1 million. If you're ready to work and make this dream a reality, hit me up. And so I thought about how many people actually called this ad looking for something quick, right? Shoot, I would have called the ad at one point Because like, it's not asking you that, it's not saying that you have to do all the work. This person already has most of the money. They're asking you to only put 10K in, and you get to be a part of this whole process, right? So business partners. And then you think about is, oh, we're going to reinvest it and we're going to make all of this money. But some of the red flags that came up to me is that that comes up is that, they want to do this in a different state. They want to separate you from your family and your friends. The other thing is that they want to see how much of a go-getter you are. Like if you can produce 10,000 in 14 to 90 days, then you're a hustler. And so they're going to utilize those skills that you have and exploit you. Again, and the other thing that stood out to me is that they're not asking you to do anything illegal. They're asking you to dance, which is legal. They're just not telling you all of it. And so I thought about this ad and I was like, there's probably a lot of people that answered that ad. The other thing we want to talk about is culture, right? And so next slide. And so our culture tends to emphasize, like partying, power, money, and sexuality, right? You think about like video games, alcohol, masculinity, gender preferences, this all plays a role into it. And so our culture creates a landscape where exploitation can be disguised as normal. Social behaviors. And so traffickers don't need like chains or violence or anything like that. They use the things that culture already celebrates, like sex appeal, wealth, partying, belonging. And so they tend to lure and control people. And we live in a culture where we have normalized all of this. I think about, I went to the movies one day and I was watching a Medea movie. And, they were talking about Uncle Joe and he was sitting somewhere and he goes, yeah, because I'm a pimp. And the whole audience started laughing. And, we think about is that we tend to make fun of it or we laugh. We actually even glorify it sometimes because you think about Halloween's going to be coming up pretty soon. And you can get a costume and be a pimp or a hoe, right? Excuse my language, but, them are costumes that you can get. And so we kind of normalize it. And you think about that the demand exists because we tolerate it. I think about different, there's this culture, there's this trafficking culture, like, like we look at traffickers as icons or businessmen and reserve capitalists, right? And the female is, especially like in movies like Hangover and stuff like that, you have like females in like roles of prostitution and it's their choice. And then they get like it's this glamorous life in which she enjoys both the trade and the benefits of the trade. A lot of times is that she is being forcefully raped 1,556 times a year if she sees at least 5 people a day, 6 days a week. We don't think about that. The other thing is that most of the time she is not getting any of the money that she makes. One of the ways that he controlled me was I was making almost $200,000 a year. But you know what? If you would have asked me to leave, I would have told you no, because I don't know how to pay bills. I don't know how to cook. I don't know how to do any of those things because he supplied all of that for me. I didn't have a concept of a dollar, even though I made money, because he took care of all of my needs. The other thing is that you think about different music, different, I think about like video games, right? Grand Theft Auto, because there's more than just one thing that's here. Is that you have the trafficker, you have the person that's being trafficked, and then you have the demand, the person that's buying it, right? And so video games like, let's say Grand Theft Auto, promotes that pimp lifestyle, right? And the demeaning treatment of women, because the object of the game, I had to tell my son one time, you need to get off that, because the way that they win is that if you abuse and beat down and kill women, you get points. And and so our society as a society, we're grooming these children to normalize a lot of these things. And so it just makes it easier for traffickers to come in and take them. There's a video that we're going to share in this next slide. It's called Making of a Girl. And I've seen a lot of videos. I've seen a lot of things, but this one right here was like the most raw. It brought up a lot of emotion for me because I could really relate to the authenticity of it. And it spoke to my experience. So I'm going to share this with you because the average age of prostitution is usually between the ages of 12 and 14 years old. So next slide, and then it's going to be that.
I'm gonna see if the audio works.
What I
on
found is if I highlight it and then it says open link, it usually opens it up. Next slide. You think about too is that, we talk about a lot about technology and you think about, like, how is this done? And when technology has made this really easy. It used to be very visible on the streets before the internet and all of that, where you knew to go in certain areas and that you would see people out there. And, when the internet came along, they said that, a lot of people were like, oh, it's going to be a lot safer. I don't have to jump in people's cars. I'm going to be in a stationed location and stuff like that. And what they found is that a lot of times it's not safer because now you may be sleeping, living, and working out of one room, and now someone can watch you at all times. You think about too is that with technology is that we have prepaid credit cards, we have these prepaid cell phones, and so someone can run a criminal enterprise from these devices, right? Because you think about if I use a prepaid card and I use a prepaid cell phone, there's no age verification, there's no identity verification, right? So I stay anonymous, and the person posting the ad stays anonymous, the person depicted in those pictures stay anonymous, and the person viewing those ads stay anonymous. And so, a lot of times is that even though the internet has been helpful in other areas, it's really made it more difficult for victims to get out. Next one is that you can't blame me for my trust issues. And so, it's important to understand the mindset of trafficking victims. So often traffickers tell their, victims is that, you can't trust the police because they're going to arrest you, which is true. That, like if you report and you have kids, you're going to lose your kids to DHS or CPS. No one's going to believe you, right? Because you're the one that's doing this. And so a lot of times they will use these threats, to keep that person in line. Victims may feel that their current situation is their fault and they may feel guilty about it and not want to leave. It's a way to cope with their situation. And then the other thing is known as, they may experience like Stockholm syndrome or PTSD. In these cases, they may even try to protect the trafficker from the authorities. I think about, when the person I was with, when the FBI came in and interviewed me, they wanted to know, like, about him. And I told them, I said, well, he's never hurt, like he never hurt me. And I had been physically abused, emotionally abused, but I was going to protect him at all cost. The way that a victim may want to see their trafficker punished is going to be different than law enforcement or society wants to see that person punished. I didn't want to see him go away, because he was the only person that I had. I did want him to stop some of the things that he was doing, but I didn't want to see him punished, in prison and sent away for 28 years. Again, is that, so I guess the victim or that person that's being trafficked may see it from a different perspective. The other thing is, as a result, trafficker victims may not even know, again, to escape, to escape detection. When we see that map and you see all those highlighted areas, let's say you get arrested in one state and you want to stay under the radar, you don't want to cause any attraction to you or your trafficker, a lot of times you tend to leave and go to another state so that you don't get on anybody's radar. The next slide. And so what is the impact of being trafficked? You know, it's the shattering of one's world, hopes, and dreams. And so they, you know, a lot of times they are overwhelmed by the disabling power of being victimized, right? The impact of that trauma is the dominant experience, and they may have difficulty functioning. The danger is that if they start identifying themselves as victims, it's going to limit their future, right? And then, so the thing that we need to do is that we need to be able to support them, and even be, you know, like have them in different, like, let's say a recovery home, right? Where they are being exposed to others in recovery and letting them know that recovery is possible. Next slide. So, you know, I won't give up on you if you don't give up on me. And so building trusting relationships with others who share similar experiences gives individuals hope. It empowers them, and you know, it accesses different recovery modalities and a holistic approach to wellness. Next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about the trafficker. And so who is the trafficker and what is their relationship to the victim? You know, and so here are just this was I got this about a year and a half ago, some statistics, and it, you know, a lot of times is that, you know, we think about the way that TV or whatever, you know, puts it out there is that someone's going to be picked up by a white van at the mall, right? They're going to be snatched up. And that's not, you know, not to say that it doesn't happen, but that's not the way that it happens, right? A lot of times the person may say that that's my boyfriend or that's my girlfriend. And they find that that is, you know, the second highest way is that the person has a romantic relationship with the individual that's trafficking them. It could be an employer with labor trafficking. And sometimes I wonder if there's more labor trafficking. I think there's probably more labor trafficking than there is sex trafficking, but we don't hear about it because people don't report it. Friends and families. And then the one that you see the most, and it's actually rising, is familiar trafficking, where a parent of that individual is trafficking them for multiple reasons. It could be for drugs. It could be, you know, for money. It could be a lot of different things. And then the lowest one is strangers. You know, so a trafficker can be anyone, right? And so what do you think a trafficker looks like? What comes to mind when you hear that word? What image comes to mind when you hear that word?
For me, it's usually like middle-aged white guy, like charming and like able to just talk to people and have like just being personable and just like your average white person.
Okay, yeah, so middle-aged white guy, charming, whatever, yeah. Anybody else?
I mean, I would have never thought what you said your trafficker looked like, right? Like he was known to the community, people knew him around. I mean, I would have never suspected anybody like that, I guess.
Yeah. Own businesses down in Detroit, you know, like prominent businesses on
Yeah.
top of, you know, what he was doing. But nobody knew what he was doing.
Wild.
You know, and so when you think about trafficker, I'm gonna tell you, when I hear that word trafficker, I'm like like you said, some middle-aged guy from another country, you know, coming over here and doing that. And so, you know, my trafficker was 19 years old when I met him. And he had been doing this since he was 16. So when he asked me to get in the car with him that day, there was no red flags. Like, oh, okay, he's nice looking, sure. You know, and he wasn't that much older than me. And so next slide. And so here are some traffickers. You know, you think about, you know, different traffickers, right? You know, we've all heard about Jeffrey Epstein, right? Prominent businessman, but had that island where he was trafficking these young girls. You know, you have, you know, like the girl, not the one with the tattoo, but the one next to her. is a victim of human trafficking, but will go out and recruit other victims. I remember when I was at 13, he asked me, did I have any friends that I could contact or bring with me? You think about the two guys in the middle right there. It was a father and son ring. They were both manipulating and trafficking women. You're finding more too is that we think about these dating sites where, single people are looking for love, right? And you have a lot of individuals that will scroll those sites and look for single women and get to know them and date them so they can get close to their kids. You had a mom and dad. You have, a woman and her boyfriend. You have, sometimes gangs. You have a 17-year-old girl recruiting right out of high school. We had a young boy here, 17 years old, Rochester Hill, which is a very affluent neighborhood. Two girls had asked him for a ride. They were going to Port Huron. They were going to pay him $30 for the ride. They had been posting on one of the websites and had an out call, which was where they go to the person and provide engagement with them. And so they got out there to Port Huron, and it was a sting operation, and they arrested him for human trafficking because he gave them the means to get there. 17 years old, getting ready to graduate from high school. And then, how many of you knew that Ice-T was a pimp?
I was honestly like, I was like, oh my gosh, is that Ice-T? What? He like literally works on a show about
human trafficking. Law and Order, SVU, yes. And, you think about, someone that we see on a regular basis, right? And he said, because he was a trafficker before he got into showbiz. And he said he went into the studio and he went in there and he spit game like he spit to these girls, right? He said he sold them a dream. He told them he had a record that was going to make them millions of dollars and blah, blah, blah. And he was like, so, you need to, you got to have a contract with me. And they said, well, let's hear your song. And he said, giving you my song is like, me giving you a grenade. Once you pull the pin, I can't put it back in. And so they signed $1 million contract with him that day. They didn't even know what he had. He said he had to go out there and find a song and a crew because he didn't have any. He just went in there and he spit game to them. And he was able to manipulate them into giving him $1 million contract, which started his career in music. And then from there went on to be in like Law and Order and stuff like that. The other thing is there's this common misconception that traffickers are easy to spot. That while there are warning signs to look out for, traffickers have carefully tailored their game through years of practice. It was easy in the 80s to pick out a pimp, right? Because they had the big flashy cars, they had the big jewelry, the fur coats. It was easy to pull that, and it was a status, right? And you think about like, yeah, oh, yeah, I know who that, I know that person must be a pimp. And it was easy to spot it. I'm going to tell you, the traffickers, today it's hard to say who a trafficker is because it could be your 15-year-old girl in high school. It could be a grandmother. It could be, we think about, men being the traffickers and women being the victims, but it can be the other way around too. And so they don't display obvious signs of their predatory nature. And so if traffickers weren't skilled at convincing potential victims that they weren't a nice person, they wouldn't be successful at what they do. And so they've learned how to fool and manipulate people. And I will tell you is that I don't know I wish I would have remembered or had, could go back and remember what he said to me that day. But he had to be charismatic because, like I said, he didn't have the internet to hide behind. He talked to me face to face, and whatever he said, I mean, I was willing to get in that car that day, not knowing what his intentions were. But once he got me in that car, he knew how to manipulate me. Like I said, he gave me a choice. He brought me back to the city and said, if you don't want to be with me, goodbye. I could have walked away that day. But I waited for him and I got in the car. thinking it was still my choice. You know, and so I think that if a person wasn't good at what they were doing, they would switch jobs and do something else, you know. The other thing is that, you know, there's a report that came out that there's, you know, like with violence and commercial sex, right? And so I think there's a next slide. There's the epidemiologist found that the average age of death for these involved in prostitution was 34 years old. I was doing a presentation for U of M one time, and I had one of the researchers in the law, you know, in the law clinic say, well, you were one of the lucky ones. And I was like, well, what is that? Because most people that are in this lifestyle don't make it out. You know, you think about, they say that the leading cause of death was homicide, either from the trafficker or the person that was buying. The second one is drugs. I probably would say that was probably higher now. You know, accidents, because a lot of times victims will use drugs just to cope, or drugs are forced upon them to perform. The other thing is there's accidents, alcohol related causes, and then, like HIV and other incurable diseases that may cause death. They say that the workplace homicide rate in prostitution is many more times higher than in any other occupation, and that some of the results from one study revealed that while in prostitution, 82% of participants had been physically assaulted, 83% had been threatened with a weapon, 68 had been raped, and 84% reported current or past homelessness. I will tell you there's some other factors that need to play in there that wasn't on there, is that how many of them had experienced sexual abuse prior to even getting into this kind of lifestyle? Because again, that is grooming them for it. Next slide, please. You know, and so you think about too is why being trauma informed is going to be important, right? It's not just what we do, but it's how we do it. And so, you know, without trauma informed care, individuals may feel judged, silenced, or re-traumatized. Trust and engagement break down. Healing is delayed on or blocked. And then what trauma informed care is it's the clients feel safe, respected, and understood. Trust grows, relationships, and they strengthen, and then healing, resilience, and empowerment are supported. So I have a peer respite where we work with Homeland Security, and we do get individuals that are recovered during sting operations. And I will tell you is that some of the experiences that we've had when we're working with someone is that, you know, it's really important to be trauma informed. Like we had a woman come in one time and I was, you know, showing her around the house and explain the process of what we were going to do with her before we even did it, so that she was aware and, you know, and if anything that may be triggering to her, she could prepare for it ahead of time. And, you know, I went in to show her where she would be sleeping. I even put her in a private room so that she didn't have to share a room with anyone else, just so that she felt safe. And all of a sudden she started screaming and I'm like, okay, what's going on? Not even thinking in that moment that the bed was a trigger for her. It brought her back to a time that she was in a motel, and that bed reminded her of that motel. And she said, it's dirty. And I'm like, what's dirty? And she goes, the bed. And I'm like, no, we washed the sheets. We washed the comforter. No, everything it's clean. And she said, no, it's dirty. And so I had to walk with her. You know, I had to collect all of the bedding, and, you know, I didn't, you know, I was still gentle with her. And I told her, I said, would you like to come with me? We're going to go here and put these in the washer, so that you can see that they're being washed. And we just washed the sheets again. I made the bed when they were done, and she felt a lot more comfortable. It took about 3 days for her, for her to open up to us a little bit, or to trust us to just to even engage with us. And so a lot of times is that what we do means more than, how we do it could mean more than what we do. The other thing is that, when you think of, sorry, next slide. So when you think about not being trauma informed, it's dismissing or minimizing the experience, right? A lot of times is that some of us that may be working with individuals have our own experiences. And so what might not be traumatic for me may be traumatic for the other person. And so you have to, make sure that you're, don't say that it's no big deal, or, other people have it worse. We don't want to minimize the experience that that person has, regardless of what it is, right? We want to validate them. The other thing is using using judgmental or stigmatizing language. And so, like labeling individuals as difficult, not compliant, or manipulative, until a person learns new ways to get their needs met, they're going to use whatever they've used in the past. And so again, is that we need to make sure that we're teaching them new coping strategies, showing them that there's options, knowing what their rights are, because a lot of times their rights have been violated, or they don't believe that they have any rights at all. And so helping them understand that. Also ignoring cultural background or history. And so when you think about this, is we're overlooking traditions, values, or historical trauma. And so just being aware of that, reacting to behaviors without asking why. And so a lot of times, especially in different agency settings, is we tend to punish or correct without exploring the root causes for it, right? Like, why would you do that? Instead of saying instead of asking you what's wrong with you, asking the person what's happened to you. And then the other thing is focusing only on compliance instead of healing. And so, emphasizing rules or outcomes over relationship and recovery. And so one of the things is that one thing that I always like tell my staff is that you need to really explain the process of what's going to, what we do while we're here. A lot of agencies and even recovery homes have rules that they have to follow. And so again, is that, letting them know ahead of time what the expectation is. Is there any of these that you're going to have a challenge with? How can I support you through this process? And so it's just making sure that we are focused on the, being more trauma informed. Next slide. So when you think about trauma informed is that we're building trust and safety. And so, survivors are more likely to open up when they feel respected and safe. And when I think about safety or safe is that it's defined by the individual. It's easy to say is that, oh, our house is safe or our agency is safe, right? But, what does safety mean for that individual? Because again, we haven't lived their experience. And when we think about safety, it's not just physical safety, it's also emotional safety. What do you need to feel safe in this space right now with me, and how can I support you? The other thing is it prevents re-traumatization, right? So avoids repeating patterns of control, judgment, or harm, and mirror past traumas. We want to promote healing and resilience, and so help the individual regain a sense of control, dignity, and hope by giving them choices, having that, be a part of the process of decision making, not making decisions for them, encouraging empathy over frustration. And so, it shifts the perspective, I guess, from, like I said earlier, is from what's wrong with you to what has happened to you. And then creates a healthier workplace, because if we're working with individuals, and it can be very challenging, is that, when we are trauma informed, it does reduce burnout. It can improve collaboration, and it fosters compassion among staff. And so just keeping that in mind, I always think about trauma-informed care, and there's those 5 principles that you want to follow, right? Safety, trust, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. And so I always try to make sure that we incorporate all of those different principles when working with anybody, because you never know who's experienced trauma and who hasn't. So using it as a universal precaution. All right, next one. And so regardless of like what agency you work at, think about your process, right? Intake process. I know that, like, think about like the application process. Is there questions on there that may help identify an individual that could be trafficked without being too invasive, I guess? Some houses are, some places may demand a urine drop. And so, and I know that people are switching over to like your mouth swabs and stuff like that. But again, they say it's less traumatizing to individuals, but for a victim of human trafficking, it could actually be more traumatizing. And so, saying is that part of the process is, let's say if that person came into a recovery home, is that it's going to be, you're going to have to drop. There may be different ways that you can do it. Which one would be most helpful for you? We think about security, so like, is the house secure? Does it have, one thing I always say is that the house is always locked from the outside. No one can come in, but the doors are unlocked from the inside. And so if a person wants to leave or walk out, they're not confined. They don't have to feel like someone, they don't have to feel like they are forced to be there. They can leave, but nobody can just walk in. And then you think about choices and safety. Next slide. And so health issues associated with victims of human trafficking. And so we think about like, substance use problems or addiction, psychological trauma from daily mental abuse and torture, including depression, stress-related disorders, disorientation, confusion, phobias, and panic attacks, feeling of helplessness, shame, humiliation, shock, denial, or disbelief. And then there's that cultural shock from finding themselves in strange places, whether it be a different city, a different state, or even a different country. And so traffickers may deliberately, introduce or force substances to control victims or keep them dependent. They're looking at, anybody that's selling drugs can basically, I know in the state of Michigan, is considered a trafficker now, because if you're using that drug to keep people dependent on coming back and buying your product, then you're considered a trafficker. Physical health problems that, individuals are a person may have is malnutrition, injuries from abuse. It could be sexual health risks, chronic pain. I've worked in a recovery home for just victims of human trafficking. And a lot of them, once they were out of that lifestyle, it's like all these health issues come up because before their body is in that fight or flight mode. And so now they get an opportunity just to relax and breathe and focus on them. And then that's when things start showing up and that need to be addressed. Daily stress and trauma can cause like different things in the body. It could be gastrointestinal problems, high blood pressure, difficulty concentrating and decision making, confusion and memory loss from constant trauma or sleep or deprivation. I remember an officer told me one time, he said he had got a call and he had went to it and the woman said she was being trafficked. And he said, so he started the investigation, asking her questions, and he asked her, well, what do you remember? And she said, the only thing I can remember is a car driving up the side of the building. And he was like, okay. First thought was that she probably needed some mental health services, right? Didn't really take her serious at that point. And then he said he kind of dismissed it. And then one day he was driving down 75, and if anybody's ever familiar with that area, we have a building, a GM building, and on the side of that building is a car driving up the side of the building. And so he went over there and he got out of his car and he looked around and there was two hotels across the freeway. And so he went over to those two hotels and he said he went in and he asked, and she had been in one of those rooms. And when he laid down on the bed, between the cracks in the curtain, he could see the car driving up the side of the building. And so he realizes that, that she was giving him what she could remember in that moment. Because when a person has been traumatized, a lot of times their brain will shut down so that they can survive whatever it is that they're experiencing. And so, when we are working with someone, we want the beginning, the middle, and the end. And that's not how it is when it comes to victims, is that they may give you the middle, a joker, the beginning, another joker in the end, and now you got to piece it together. But listen to them because they're sharing something with you. And I will tell you, a lot of times they don't share anything if they don't trust you. So victims of trafficking, face layers and interconnected health issues. And so it's going to be important. I know a lot of the recovery homes, a lot of times is that, they're focused on one thing, and that's giving shelter and, focusing on the recovery of individuals that are there. But when you get someone that has had these multiple layers of trauma and being exploited and trafficked, is that, they could be doing well one minute and the next minute, they're they're destroying every aspect of their whole life. You know, because a lot of times when a person gets out of that lifestyle, they believe that it's over, it's done with, and they don't have to go through it anymore. But trauma has a way of coming up and resurfacing 20 years later. And so again, and it can destroy everything. So just being aware of that. Next slide. All right, so if you think an individual is a victim, do not try to rescue the person unless it's a minor and you have mandated reporting. Don't ask them to share their story with you. I know some organizations will make a person share their story as soon as they come in for services, and it's like, no, that person needs to process their story and heal from that first before they go out and start telling it. Do not contact authorities without permission, especially, well, when it comes to adult, unless you're mandated to do so, because there may be children involved in the relationship, and they may be in harm's way. Do not make promises you can't keep. And so if you say that you're going to help a person, explain what kind of help you can offer. Because, I'm going to tell you, it's going to be really hard to meet all of the needs that a person may have, and then provide the individual with resources and the freedom to use resources when ready. A lot of times we can, I always say we can show them where the water is, but we can't make them drink it. And so we can give them the resources, but allow them to be able to use those resources when they want to. Next slide. So psychological concerns, and again, is that we talk about addictions, right? And it doesn't necessarily just have to be drugs. I will tell you that I was more addicted to the lifestyle than I was the drugs or the person I was with. Because I had been in it for so long, it took me until I was almost 40 years old to get out of it. Even though I was no longer being trafficked, I still had a hard time separating myself from that lifestyle. Psychological trauma from daily mental abuse, including, like I said, some of these disorders that a person may have, feelings of helplessness and shame and humiliation, shock from finding themselves, and I think I've already done that slide. So, all right. And so again, we can, assessing again is, what is your agency equipped to handle, and what areas would you have to maybe refer out to so that that person can get the support that they need. Next slide. And so when we think about safety and gaining trust, first step in providing any type of assistance is knowing you cannot do it all by yourself, right? Know who your allies are in your community or state, and one program cannot meet all of the needs, and you're not expected to do so either. And so, again, is that Polaris hotline. I'm going to give that number in a little bit, but that number will give you resources in your state. Findhelp.org is another great resource. You go in and put your state and the city, the county that you're in, and you can put up, you can like describe what resources you're looking for, and it will give you all the information. You have 211. I always say go online and look at it through the internet instead of calling. You get a lot more resources available to you when you do that. There's another one that's coming out. I don't know if it's hit your state yet, but we have this thing called Julie's List.homestead.com. And I know that she's extending it to all the states. It's a great resource. It's always updated. But you can actually still go on there, and there's a lot of national human trafficking organizations also. And you guys have a lot of allies in your communities. Recovery homes specifically for victims of human trafficking. And a lot of times those programs are like 2-year programs. There's no cost to the victim at all. They get the life skills that they need, the employment skills that they need, learning how those basic skills that they may need, things like that, because they may not have been taught those things. Next slide. So there are 4 general areas of victims' needs, and that is immediate assistance. And so, it could be medical care, it could be safety and security, it could be food, shelter, and even legal services, especially if the person has, maybe they're in, family court, they could be having warrants for their arrest, they could have a lot of different things. It could even be legal status. The other thing is mental health and substance abuse assistance. And so counseling, inpatient or outpatient services, recovery housing, all of these are going to be important to address those issues that are coming up. Income assistance. So there could be like cash assistance, living assistance. They may need insurance because they probably don't have insurance, and then legal status. So again, it might be that T visa that we talked about earlier, the person may need to apply for. It could be they may have warrants. And again, is that, so there's a lot of different needs that people have, and knowing how to address those needs and being able to find the resources to help them. So next slide. All right, and so prevention, what are the next steps? And so why should you care, right? What can you do? And so, next slide. So when you think about why you should care is that human trafficking is in our community and it's growing. The average age of entry into commercial sex is 12 to 14 years old, and they could be your sister, your brother, your friend, or even your child, right? And so what are some of the ways that you could bring awareness to your community? I always say is that you can be a part of educating your community, your schools, to get people to be more aware of what's going on. Even your agency. Maybe there's some things in your agency that you can change through your protocol. Is there a person that works specifically with individuals if someone has been identified? If you have someone within your agency that has that history, is that, like having that peer-to-peer work together, it builds that connections a little bit faster. And so think about ways that you can bring awareness to your communities. The other thing is, next slide, look around you, right? Is someone that you provide support to being trafficked? Think about, have they been labeled difficult or hard to work with or things like that? I worked with a woman, and I remember staff telling me, oh, she's not gonna do much. Just go out there, take a look at her, and then just say that you've seen her. And when I got out there, I was taking her to a resource, and I took her to the wrong place, and they said it wasn't open yet. So we sat on the porch and we were talking, and to find out is that, yep, she was out there working, and how she got out there is that, she had met a guy, and he told her that, if she'd be willing to do this for them, that they could get a place together and they could move in together. And so she started working to earn the money to get him and give it to him so that they could get a place. And to find out is that he was using her money to buy drugs and get high. And she didn't even use drugs at the time. And so she said, now I'm sitting here with a heroin addiction and I don't know what to do. I'm no longer with him, like we're not together, but now I have this addiction and I don't know what to do. And so, we talked about what our options were that day. So sometimes it's really sitting down and just listening to someone, finding what the story that they, what's the story that they live out or what they believe about themselves, and what options that they have. Would you know what to say to a person if you come across, right? Or if you engage with someone, like what questions, to ask and not to ask. And I will tell you is that, you think about, if I'm working with someone or if I'm putting questions within a, part of my intake process or whatever, what questions would I want to ask? And so the next slide. And so questions that you could ask is like, how are things going for you these days? What does a typical day look like for you? Do you get much time to rest or relax? How do you stay, who do you stay with? Do you feel comfortable where you're living? Do you get a choice where you stay? What kind of work are you doing right now? How do you usually find jobs? What do you like or not like about your work? Again, as these are some common questions. You're not going to go down the whole list and ask them. You don't want to make it a verbatim checklist, right? It's just questions that we may ask using those open-ended questions just to get more information. I know on my form I put on there, have you ever been trafficked? And I let them know the reason I'm asking it is because there's more services available to you if you've had that history. And people will identify a lot quicker if they know it's not going to be used against them. Questions that you want to stay away from is like, have you ever had to, it's a question I would use if I built a relationship with that person a little bit, or feel like if that I could, is that, you know, have you ever had to exchange sex for money or a place to stay? You know, has anyone ever asked you to have sex with another person? Who provides or controls your access to substances? That would be a question I could probably ask if I knew the person was using drugs. And then, do you have access to medical care if you needed it? And so again, is think about a list of questions that you could ask someone that could get that person to open up a little bit more to find out if this is someone that potentially could have experienced trafficking. Next question. So you may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you didn't know. And so again, is that you can go out and, like I said, is educate the community. You can educate your coworkers. You can educate people, even educate the individuals that are being served. Because, you know, as a child, if I would have known what that was before I even met him, I would have probably been more aware and not so easily misled. And so again, is that educating people. Next slide. And so I think about the starfish story is that I might not be able to go out there and save the world, but I might be able to make a difference. And so there's a story about the starfish, and I'm sure some of you already know it, is that this woman's going down the beach and there's like 1 million starfish on the beach, and she's throwing them in one by one. And a guy comes along and he goes like, "What are you doing?" And she goes, "Well, I'm saving the starfish." And he said, "But there's miles of beach and there's millions of starfish. You can't possibly throw them all back in." And she said, "But it makes a difference to this one." And she throws it back into the ocean. So you might not be able to stop human trafficking, but you might be able to make a difference in one person's life, you know. And so being aware, knowing what resources are available, being able to be that person that someone can talk to, and knowing who your allies are. Next slide. Just some other things to remember really quick is not every victim you identify will feel safe to leave their situation. And so don't think about it as, well, you know, forget them then, because they may return. They may feel like that's their only option. Until we can show them and provide them what they need, they're not going to leave. Let them know your setting is a safe place. And again, finding out from that individual what that safeness looks like. Offer resources and hotlines. Use that trauma-informed approach, and empowerment versus saving. I will tell you, most of the survivors I know are resilient. They don't need to be saved, and they're not broken, so you don't need to fix them, but they do need support. They need encouragement. And so, you know, empower the individual. Next slide. And even if you never have to use it, keep this phone number in your phone, because you never know when you may need to use it. This is the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, Polaris, and it is 1-888-3737-888. Really easy to remember. Again, put this in your phone. Hopefully you'll never have to use it, but if you do, you have that phone number. Again, is never try to stop someone that you may feel like is a trafficker, or they're trafficking someone, because if you step in, you're taking away their livelihood. And so it can turn to a bad situation really quick. All you have to do is report it. They will contact local law enforcement. They will do investigations. They will do all of that. You don't have to do any of it. And so the last slide. Does anybody have any questions? I'm always open. All right. Well, it is 12 o'clock. I know you guys are probably ready for lunch. And I appreciate
have a question.
Okay, yes.
Okay, first, I appreciate really you share your personal history. It really is very powerful. So see you there and teaching this to us really is amazing. And really, I'm very grateful for why you do it. So I have a question, and maybe it's a thinking too. So it's because of talking about sexual trafficking, I've been in several trainings, and also I see happen in the war not only in this country, it's happened everywhere. So because we talk also about PIMS and the victims, what about the clients? What do you think about the clients, the people who are the demand of this kind of trafficking? What do you think? What are you thinking about this?
Well, I think, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's my question.
Well, I
basically.
think that there needs to be more punishment. And, they did a survey and they asked individuals that were arrested for, engaging in this type of activity. They asked them like, what would, I think that when a person is arrested for that kind, picking up or engaging in sexual activity and paying for it, that they should be, they talked about the sex offender registry. They talked about, different putting their faces on billboards. But a lot of times it's like, oh, this person is a prominent person in the community and we don't want to ruin their lives.
That's true.
And so we kind of brush it under the rug. Right now I don't know about your state, but I know in our state is if a person is arrested, they lose their car, they impound their car and they give them a fine. And a lot of those individuals, and they have to go to John's school. They have to go to a school where they are working with some of the victims of trafficking, and they have to do community service and things like that. And a lot of them said that's not a deterrent for them.
Yeah,
It's not a
really
high
hard,
enough
really
risk.
sad, yeah. Yeah, no,
Huh?
it's really hard, really sad because it's a power. It's a power, and this clients in demand is really powerful. Family, parents, family, directors, teachers, scientists, but it's nothing happened to them. That's kind of hard. I'm in Washington State, so policies are really sometimes here is very flexible for a lot of things, but it's really sad when we try to do something, but the policy and regulations don't allow us to do too much.
Yeah.
This
Well,
is the tough
right,
thing.
we have to really do something about the demand. There needs to be a punishment from them because they're criminalizing the victims. They're punishing the trafficker, but there is no repercussion for the person that's buying it. And if there was no demand, there wouldn't be a supply.
Totally agree. Totally agree with that.
Yep. So there needs to be more. There's still more work to do.
Yes. Thank you for that.
Be a voice. I'm serious. Be a voice in your communities. Go to meetings. The commissions for the state have open meetings where people can have a voice and share and talk about what needs to be done. And your voices are powerful. Yeah. Anybody else have any questions at all? All right. I just want to say thank you for having me. I hope that you took something away that will help you in your work, working with individuals and, just understanding like, what it could be for that individual and like, staying trauma informed. So thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Deborah.
you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you.
Thanks for giving us so much that we needed to hear.
Thanks, Deborah.
For sure.
Thank you.
Very powerful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you. All right.
Bye-bye.